Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the Senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. Welcome to a really special edition of Kibbitzing with Kagan. With me today is Don Graham, the former publisher of the Washington Post, and so much more. It's going to be a very exciting conversation. Thank you so much, Mr. Graham, for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thank you, Senator. Glad to kibitz anytime.
Thank you. So you and I have worked together on some legislative issues, but I'm going to start and with your childhood and work our way up to the present. So you grew up in a journalistic household. You went to St. Albans, went to Harvard. You had quite the education, quite the interesting career. And I want to start with the fact that you were editor of the St. Albans newspaper as well as its competitor. Talk about that.
Yeah, I was the editor of like a lot of people who go into journalism, I was a little newspaper nut in my childhood. I idolized my father, who was the publisher of the Washington Post, and I was the editor of the St. Albans News. And then in college, I was the president of the Harvard Crimson. Jesus, that's a long time ago. But
long time ago. Did getting elected as the editor of the Crimson, was that easier or harder with your last name and your family legacy?
Well, Graham's a pretty common name, and the Washington Post is a much bigger deal now than it was in 1962, believe me. And so it was, but I think if people complain about being part of a family, you think, well, I'm sure that's a problem, but it's probably not one of the 2 billion or so biggest problems in the world.
True that. So one of the biggest problems, and I hate to talk about this, but not talking about it just seems wrong also. Your father, so respected, so loved, really struggled with mental health and died by suicide when you were about to head off to Harvard, I guess. Is there anything you want to say about your dad, what you remember, or anything about suicide, since we lose about 130 Americans a day to death by suicide?
Well, we do, Senator. And my dad, like many of those 130 people, suffered from bipolar illness. This was 1963. My dad was my absolute hero, the brightest guy, the funniest guy I think I ever met to this day. But in 1963, there was no treatment for bipolar illness that had been approved by the FDA. Today, there are excellent treatments. And anybody who is the parent of somebody or anybody who has felt a serious urge to commit suicide must go talk to a doctor and must seek treatment. And those treatments can help you lead a very good life. I know many people who've lived long, successful lives suffering from that illness.
And we also ought to reference there is now 988, a 3-digit number for anyone who is thinking about suicide or struggling and needs someone to talk to. And there are wonderful counselors and listeners at the other end of that phone. So after Harvard, you volunteered for the draft and went to Vietnam. Why did you do that? And what was that like?
Well, it was 1966. The war in Vietnam was in its earliest stages. I guess my feeling toward Vietnam was it didn't seem like a great idea, but my father had served, my grandfather had served, every adult I knew had served, and I had no reason.
Every male adult.
Yes, right. Since I was born in 1945, every male adult.
Yes.
But I didn't have a reason. I didn't want to be a doctor. I wasn't a conscientious objector. And so I did. I volunteered for the draft. I was drafted, and I was sent to Vietnam in 1967.
What did your mom think?
She wasn't thrilled, but I mean, it was the law. And I think she felt probably that I was doing the right thing, but she probably hoped I wouldn't have to go.
Yes, yes. So when you came back, and I think this is the coolest thing ever. You worked as a patrolman in the DC Police Department, and your ties to
Did.
DC have been so strong your whole life. Talk about why you did that and something you learned about DC that you didn't know beforehand.
Senator, I was brought back. I came back from Vietnam in July of 1968. The riot in Washington, which us people my age remember, took 3 days. Many people died, many people were injured, and a whole lot of Washington, 7th Street, 14th Street, 8th Street, Northeast, burned.
Yes.
And those arsons were still visible 40 years later, less so now. My mother was, as we'll discuss, my mother was a very uneasy publisher of the Washington Post and wanted me to come to work there.
Yes.
I felt I was better if I did something to learn about the city first.
Yes.
I thought of teaching in a public school, and ironically, I couldn't do that at the time because it required an education degree, which I didn't have. Mm-hmm. And the police, all male at the time, were desperate for people. So I joined. I told them I would last only 18 months till my wife graduated from law school. And they said that would be above average.
Okay.
That's
what you did. Yeah.
The most valuable thing I learned from being a policeman is that I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, that other people who'd been there 3 years, 5 years were automatically better police because they knew where the bad guys lived. They knew how to respond in certain situations. But after 18 months of going into people's homes when they were desperate, I knew a lot more about the city.
Yeah, I bet. So let's talk about journalism. Your grandfather bought the Washington Post in a bankruptcy sale in 1933, and then your dad, and then following his death, your mom were publishers. Talk about what it was like to grow up in the Washington Post community and in that family around journalism.
Well, thank you, Senator. It was some family. My grandfather, Eugene Meyer, bought the Post, as you said, at a bankruptcy sale and paid $825,000 in 1933. Now, the Post he bought wasn't the Washington Post of today. It was the number 4 paper in a 5-paper town. It claimed circulation of 50,000, which it probably didn't have. And he believed that if he made the paper better, editorially, that it would gain circulation, that by more readers, it would get more advertising, and he could break even in 3 years. He lost $1 million a year, 1933 to $54 for 21 years. Wow. And he didn't own another business. He paid the losses out of his pocket. So he was a brave guy, but also a very good businessman in the sense that he saw the winning paper in Washington would be quite a successful business. My dad, taking over after the war, was just the person to follow. He bought 2 television stations early, which was a genius thing to do. The 2 of them together bought the other morning paper in Washington, the Washington Times-Herald, in 1954. And the Post still was the number 2 paper in Washington until 1960. So it was always a struggle. It was an unsuccessful paper till 1954, and then barely profitable for a few years after that.
After your stint in the police department, you joined the Washington Post as a reporter in 1971, and you ultimately became its publisher from 1979 to 2000. What are some of the stories you're proudest of?
Well, I guess the most unusual story has to do with my boss, who was also my mother.
Yes.
And it would be of interest to all the women listening to you, Senator. My mother, Catherine Graham, was certainly in 1963, when my dad died, she had to make a very difficult decision. The Post had been wholly owned by my father and her. And I think most people expected her to sell it because no woman was running a business of that size in 1963.
Yes.
But she had watched her father and her husband struggle for most of her life for the good of the paper and decided to try to keep it and run it, which was a very brave thing to do. The paper went public in 1971, sold stock on Wall Street for the first time. And when we went public, Katharine Graham was the only woman CEO of a Fortune 1000 company, 999 guys and her.
Amazing.
She remained as CEO until 1991, and she knocked it out of the park. So that was the most unusual thing about the company I went to work for.
So I have to give a shout out to the fact that she went to Vassar, which is my alma mater.
She did.
Yes. So what are your memories of Watergate? Obviously, Richard Nixon spoke a bit profanely about her, and he was not president of her fan club. What do you remember from that era?
Oh, I remember it vividly. Even before Watergate in 1971, she and President Nixon had clashed over what was the episode called the Pentagon Papers.
Yes.
Where Daniel Ellsberg, a fellow who was a PhD working in the Pentagon, had been very upset that he had worked for years at the request of Secretary McNamara on a history of how the United States got into the war in Vietnam, which involved a lot of lying and misleading of the public on the part of senior people in the U.S. government. He gave the papers to the New York Times only.
Yes.
They printed them for a couple of days, and then a federal judge in New York stopped them from printing anymore. Ellsberg, to show that that wouldn't stop him, then gave the papers to an editor of the Washington Post who had been calling him. That editor, this is 1971, put the papers in a cardboard box, bought 2 tickets on the Eastern shuttle from Boston to Washington, put himself in one seat and the Pentagon Papers in the other, put seatbelts around both, and flew to Washington and took a taxi to Ben Bradley's house and dumped the Pentagon Papers on Ben's living room floor. So the next morning, the Post printed a story based on the Pentagon Papers after a very dramatic night. Yes. Where my mother had to decide whether we would also print these papers, although we were going public, selling stock for the first time that same week. And her lawyers were advising her, there are risks, you might want to do this. Bradley was telling her, there's an extreme risk if you don't print it. The reporters, the staff all know we have these, and it'll be terrible if you don't. She had to decide on a phone call with Ben and the lawyers at 7:00 at night, and she said, go ahead, let's print.
Yeah.
And we printed. We were sued by the federal government. The Post and the Times were each eventually stopped from printing by a court. That went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 6-3, still the law of the land, that the government couldn't stop a paper from printing a news story in advance. If the paper libeled someone or broke the law, they could be punished afterwards. Yeah. But the government had no right to stop a newspaper from printing someone based on the record in the Pentagon Papers. So
I wonder what this Supreme Court would have done. But yes, please. Sorry.
I do not know, but there are members of the court who are pretty strongly pro First Amendment, but I have no idea.
Yeah.
But then one year later, June 17th, 1972, exactly 50 years ago, a bunch of very unusual burglars in suits, some of them, broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate office building. And a very wise, smart security guard named Frank Wills saw that a stairway door had been opened, shut it. Then he came back and saw it had been taped open. Mm-hmm. And he called the police and said there were burglars inside. They found them inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee and arrested all 5. Yeah. There were 2 members of the White House staff across the street watching and listening who realized the whole thing had gone up in smoke. the Post, it was a local police story, so the Post was all over it.
Yeah.
And critical moment, one of our police reporters who'd been there forever was told by one of the cops that in the address book of one of the burglars was the telephone number of a White House aide named Howard Hunt. So Carl Bernstein got on the phone and called Howard Hunt's office, and his assistant asked to speak to Mr. Hunt. His assistant said, well, he's down the hall with Mr. Colson. Let me get him. Charles Colson was one of Nixon's closest aides, but I'll tell him. So Hunt called him back, and Bernstein said, Mr. Hunt, what was your address and phone number doing in the address book of one of the burglars arrested at the Watergate last night? And Hunt said, oh, shit, and hung up. And that was the start of the darndest moment. The Post, you can't imagine this in the day of the internet, but there was no internet then. The Post was printing stories like that one that other newspapers couldn't confirm because they didn't have the sources.
Right.
And Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, when put on this story, took enormous pains to seek out sources, calling on people at their homes at night, calling on them again and again, until they got information one step at a time. Yeah. I was with Katharine Graham the morning of June 18th when she was told about the Watergate burglary. I will guarantee you that if someone had told her or Ben Bradley that the president would ultimately resign over this, they'd have said, that's ridiculous.
Right, right. Wow. And if anyone watching has not either read and or watched All the President's Men, I beg you to do it. It is such a critically important part of American history, and it's just brilliant journalism and quite intrepid reporting.
You're right to refer to both the book and the movie. The book is fantastic, but
Yes.
The movie is a surprisingly good, careful, accurate movie about one aspect of what happened. I think, much as I love the Washington Post, it does leave out a lot of other key actors in the long-term story of Watergate, like special prosecutors, like the Senate Watergate Committee, like Judge John Sirica. But as far as what happened at the Post, it's pretty darn good.
Yeah, yeah. And it's very well acted with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman and so many others. But let's move on. When your mom, as you said, was the rare, very rare woman and one in the top Fortune 1000, what do you think was the importance of diversity in an editorial board, in a newspaper? What differences did you see between your father's leadership and your mother's?
Well, it was, I would say my father was certainly as open to women in positions as most men of his day. But in my mother's day, because of her and because of the times, remember that the 1960s, when she took over, that was the moment when women, because of Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Simone de Beauvoir and others, were starting to say to themselves, maybe we don't have to live our lives the same way our mothers and grandmothers did. Maybe we can enter professions. Maybe we can go to business school or law school. And it wasn't as it is today, where women were fully considered equal, and where deans of law schools expected that more than half their class would be women. There were very few women partners in law firms, a few, but very few.
Yes.
There were very few senior women in business, again, a few. There were senior women in the government, but the government had been a better employer than business had. And at the newspaper, there were women who reported to people who reported to Ben Bradley. There was no woman who reported to my mother. There was no woman who reported to anyone who reported to my mother. I suspect my mother in 1963 probably went a month between being in business meetings with another woman.
Wow.
But
what about
gradually,
yeah,
it's a great story that some good historian is going to write. By the 1970s, women were pushing up through the ranks of reporters. with more ambition, hoping to, and I say with more ambition, I think that's probably wrong, with an ambition that was more likely to be realized.
Yes.
And then one thing I'm very proud of at the Post was among the first newspapers anywhere in which women got the full opportunity to do all the jobs at the newspaper. The superintendent of the press room at the Washington Post today is Beverly McLaughlin, who's a Maryland resident, who's a woman and an African American. And in 1963, when my mother takes over, there's absolutely no women or African Americans in the press room. There are women in senior positions in circulation and advertising, and also there are women machinists and women electricians and so on.
I was going to ask about, I mean, obviously she was there, you were there during, as you already referred to, the race riots, the civil rights movement. How did the Post staff and leadership in terms of racial diversity, how slowly, how effectively was that diversity and that development happen?
Slowly, and then quicker, and then quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Len Downey, who was the editor of the Washington Post, deserves some credit here. But what I learned about diversity back in the long ago days of the 70s and 80s, I absolutely made every mistake you can make in that arena, but we did some things right. There was an intense focus that I would recommend to anybody on hiring. And this was the Washington Post. And our feeling was that for any reporter's job or any ad salesman's job or any business job, we ought to be trying to hire people who could not only do the job they were coming in to do, but could advance.
Yes.
And we invested, it seems this was the height of craziness. If press operators wanted to go to college at the Rochester Institute of Technology, which was the #1 printing school in the East Coast, we paid for their college education in full. Turned out that we got such a spectacular return on that investment. You couldn't believe it.
And again, this was not online learning. This was
no.
All right.
Well, actually, yeah, but keep going.
Let's talk about online research. Do you think, I mean, it's certainly a lot easier, as it was for me, I mean, to dig into the nooks and crannies of your life, your professional background and personal life by, thanks to the internet. Do you think that's made journalism better or worse? Is it too easy and folks get lazy, or is the access so broad that it leads to a better outcome?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think we'll know until people study the matter more. That I think I became an adult in the 60s and 70s, and a newspaper played a critical role at that point. The news on television was important, was widely watched, but could only tell you so much. Walter Cronkite used to say that every word on the CBS Evening News could be printed in 2/3 of a page of that day's New York Times. Mm-hmm. And so the newspaper was the principal source of information. Our research told us that the average reader of the Washington Post spent 37.5 minutes with the paper. Today, people feel overwhelmed with the information available to them.
Yeah.
I'm sure they do,
Yeah. So similar question, the development of social media, obviously not such a thing when back in the post most visible era in the 70s and stuff. Do you think social media, and you were on the board of Facebook, is that an asset or liability when it comes to informing citizens and voters?
For me, it's been an asset. being on Facebook for me means staying in touch with people I wouldn't otherwise. I've got relatives all over the country I never see except on Facebook, and it provides welcome news and entertainment and keeps me up with people that I otherwise couldn't. I've got so many friends who used to be on the Post and now are here, there, and everywhere.
Yes.
I am not. People want to say that social media is responsible for all the good and bad things, particularly the bad things in this country now. As you said, I was a board member of Facebook in its early days. I met Mark Zuckerberg when he was 20, and that's another interesting story. But social media, and I think even more important, Google, brought to you and brought to all your constituents and brought to everybody the opportunity to learn about things, but also the opportunity to have a lot of information, true and false, put in front of them.
Yes.
I remember on Wikipedia for 10 years, I was married to my brother and my brother's ex-wife. So
wow. Okay.
As every school teacher knows, you can't take for granted every scrap of information that turns up on the internet.
True that. Before I pivot to another thing, which media outlets do you admire most and why? And they can be printed, electronic, TV, blogs. Like, what do you really look to as a resource that you respect?
I love the Washington Post still because I know the people on it. And I know, for instance, when I read a story by Dan Baltz, I'm reading something by a newspaper reporter famous for balance, fairness, and integrity.
Yes.
I know the columnists, and I know when I read a column by George Will, whom is not of my school politically, but George is a conservative, used to be a Republican, who spends his time talking to people out in the States, listening, learning, and I'm going to learn something from reading him.
Mm-hmm.
I read to find out things I don't know. The Post helps me. As a business person, I absolutely have to read the Wall Street Journal. And I'll tell you a news organization, unfortunately very expensive, that I have come to admire more and more is a newspaper in London called the Financial Times. Again, I think one of the great things about it is every other newspaper in England is a party paper. It's either a conservative or a Labour paper. The Financial Times is scrupulously neutral. And it tells me news about Europe and the rest of the world that isn't necessarily making the other papers in the United States. The most expensive news organization in the United States, but one I greatly admire for its fairness, is Bloomberg News.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
okay.
Again.
I want to move on.
Yeah.
Sorry, I still have so many questions. We are in the midst of an election season. How challenging was it helping facilitate, oversee the writing of candidate endorsements, editorial endorsements, and how mindful were you of their impact? Do you think they are still as influential as they were then?
I was very influential. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the Post's endorsement were very influential in some parts of the Washington, Maryland, Virginia area. We endorsed Doug Wilder, who became the first Black governor of any state.
1981.
Doug won.
1991.
Doug won by such a small margin that any large family could claim they put him over the top, but we endorsed him so many times that I think we did. Our endorsements, as I think you know, used to be super influential in Montgomery County. Perhaps are. They certainly were influential at moments in Washington, D.C. And I was well aware that this was an important thing we did. I paid attention to it. Luckily, our editors were two people named Meg Greenfield and then Fred Hyatt, in whom I could repose total trust, and I did.
Great. I think now that I'm thinking about it, Doug Wilder was 1989, but I have to check myself. You pride yourself on being an independent. You've never donated to a political candidate ever. You ever been tempted? And then as a journalist, I mean, now the changes in journalists not even pretending to be independent, whether you look at Fox or MSNBC, Thoughts about that?
I'm distressed by the latter, but I'll talk a minute about myself.
Yes.
Since I went to work at the Washington Post in 1971, as you said, I've never attended a fundraiser and I've never given to a political candidate of either party. Yes, I've been tempted, for example, two members of my family, Bob Graham, the former senator from Florida, is my uncle, my dad's half brother, and his daughter Gwen was a congresswoman and then ran for governor of Florida. And I was very tempted to give to them, but I felt very constrained at the time. I was a journalist most of my life. My wife, Amanda Bennett, is now the CEO, just got confirmed, of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which runs the Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, and so on. And if I am a donor to anyone, then she becomes the wife of a Democratic donor, and I don't. She is another old-fashioned, totally neutral, totally bipartisan editor, and I want that to be clear.
Yes, yes. You have 4 kids from your first marriage. Are any of them in journalism?
No, they are. My son Will is a TV writer and producer. Just was the showrunner of something called A League of Their Own on Amazon Prime, which I highly recommend to anyone. I have a daughter who's an opera.
The women's baseball.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And then I have two daughters who are business women, and one who is an opera singer and actress in London.
Cool.
One of my kids lives in Washington, 3 are in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and London. So
nice. All right, let's finally pivot to how you and I got to work together. How did you get involved with DACA? And why don't you talk about why you think it's important, what the issue is, what aspect of the issues you're most passionate about?
Thanks, Senator. Well, I got involved in the education of immigrant youth very circuitously. I was the publisher of the Post, and we were not only careful about partisanship, we did not pull strings behind the scene. I didn't ask for meetings with mayors of Washington to try to tell them what to do or so on. We were journalists. We could tell the story, and that was our job. But we wanted to do useful things in the community, and the DC public schools looked like an area that could use our help. In 1999, I became the chairman of a scholarship fund for all the public school and charter school students in Washington, D.C. That fund made a big difference over 20 years. I turned over its chairmanship to Ted Leonsis.
Nice.
I wasn't looking for something else to do, but I was haunted by the fact that there was one group of students we never had been able to help, and this was the first small, then growing group called the Dreamers, the children of undocumented immigrants. And I, as you do, Senator, and as the people listening to this broadcast do, I love this country. I love it in old-fashioned ways. But I thought we were treating these children cruelly in a way that Americans don't normally do. Why did I think so? They came here as very small children. The ones I met came here very, very young and had grown up believing, most of them, that they were American citizens because a family that came here illegally probably wouldn't tell that to an 8-year-old, because the 8-year-old is going to tell somebody else. So they get to high school and they suddenly learn, alone of all the students in your class, you will get no help going to college if you live in Washington, D.C. You get some help if you live in Maryland, but you do not get a Pell Grant as your classmates do, and you cannot borrow a cent. Now, people complain about student debt, but for low-income students, I think it is literally impossible to go to college without some kind of aid. It's past the point where you can, quote, work your way through college. The jobs you can get $15, $20 an hour, you can't save enough for today's tuitions.
Right. So I'm going to interrupt you here because I did a bad thing, which is I used an acronym, and I always correct everyone else. DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And And let's talk about the legislation that you and I worked on together, because we
Well,
were just talking about how you're recovering from knee surgery and what a huge nursing shortage there is. So why don't you talk about the bill that we worked on together and are bringing back in 2023?
we learned from an immigrant student who wrote a piece saying that Maryland, which has been wonderful to undocumented immigrants, it gives them in-state tuition to universities, as many states do. It gives them state financial aid, which few states do. But when it
And
comes
legislative
time,
scholarships,
right, but
senators
when
and delegates, yes.
it comes time that, let us say, a man or woman has majored in nursing and wants to become a nurse, Maryland does not permit fully undocumented students who do not have a work permit from the federal government to take the nursing exam, the teaching exam, or enter other professions where there are critical shortages across the state. As you just said, Senator, the state is desperate for nurses. Any doctor, any hospital will tell you that.
Yes.
We are educating our little scholarship program. 20% of the students who enroll are healthcare majors, most of them nursing majors. We are graduating college graduate nurses who've been in American schools since kindergarten, who can't work as nurses because of our mad immigration laws. And you and a friend are working to correct that.
Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnyk, who is one of the most extraordinary legislators in the state of Maryland, was our wonderful partner on this. And last year it passed the Senate because of the urgency of the emergent need for healthcare workers, not just nurses, but physicians' assistants, home healthcare workers. I mean, anyone who needs a license. And unfortunately, in the waning days of the 90-day session, we ran out of time and it didn't pass the House. But she and I and others are working to bring it back. Anything more you want to talk about the importance of this issue before we pivot to one more thing?
The other thing I want to say about this bill, I know people have all kinds of complicated feelings about immigration, but here is something, the treatment of these young people, no one is disadvantaged by it. If we can get more nurses, we should do anything we can to get more nurses. Every nurse in the state of Maryland has, believe me, all the work they want, and any nurse will tell you that. But here we have eager people, qualified people, able people. They would have to pass the same exam everyone else does, but it helps everyone and hurts no citizen, hurts no one.
And just to be clear, these are students that we have educated, maybe from kindergarten, and paid to educate. We have given them scholarships. We have given them in-state tuition. We have helped to train and inspire them. And then when they want to start their career, they move out of state because they are not allowed to work in Maryland. That's
They're Maryland
crazy.
residents. They're Maryland natives. That's right. Not quite Maryland natives, but they're totally Maryland educated.
Right. So I want to talk about the remarkable work you do giving back to the community and your commitment. You have the Philip L. Graham Foundation named in memory of your dad. I used to run a charitable foundation. I looked at some of the wonderful groups that you have supported in the whole DC, Maryland, Virginia region. How do you decide, other than that one, obviously, you also have served on many other awards boards and nonprofit boards. How do you decide which boards to serve on and to whom to give your time and resources?
Not very scientifically. I mean, my life, particularly being a cop for that year and a half, but also being on the post, I learned about a lot of places where the lowest income people in the region need help. I, of course, learned they need food. I learned that they need shelter. And when riding the streets as a police officer, I saw many people sleeping on the streets, and they didn't want to be there. They wanted a place to live. There are wonderful organizations that help them get that serve whatever other needs they have that are compelling them to live on the street to try to get them to a better life. And then everybody wants a better education for their kids, and it's harder to get for lower income people. And that has been the focus of what little community work I've been able to do for my life. That's been my feeling.
So the last question before we go to the Fast Five, what legacy do you hope to leave?
None particularly. I mean, I'm going to leave 4 great kids. That's probably the most important legacy that I'll live.
Okay.
But I do, at this point in my life, I'm really focused on trying to help the rest of us understand that the immigrant community in the United States is a source of benefit to this country. I'm not talking about the situation at the border, which I think is very, very wrong and very, very challenging. But I'm talking about immigrants who've lived here for 10 and 20 years, paid taxes, and been good citizens. I think some of them have earned our respect and our trust.
Agreed. Thank you. Thank you for your partnership. You're the one who brought me that issue and that bill, and I immediately said yes. And I was thrilled when Jocelyn Pena-Melnyk agreed to be my partner, and we are going to get it done in 2023. And hopefully Governor Westmore will sign it into law right away.
I know he will, but I really admire the 2 of you for your work on this. Thank you, Senator.
Of course. So we're going to pivot to the Fast Five. Now, normally those are 5 quick questions and 5 quick answers to let folks get to know you better. And normally it's about your favorite junk food or your favorite sport, but I couldn't do that with Don Graham. So I have way different questions. So first, question number 1, you have been called nice and an optimist. What makes you angry?
Well, injustice. And but I mean, I would describe myself as rather slow to anger. I'm not angry about politics. I'm not angry at people who disagree with me. I have dear friends I worked with at the Post who have views that I don't. So I think there may be a little too much anger running around our society right now.
True.
The things I see, there people are treated unfairly.
Yes. Question number 2. What is one thing that someone watching this podcast can do to make a difference?
Everyone in the course of their life sees things that are great about this country and also sees things that are wrong. And it's pro-American, not anti-American, I think, to work to make things better. That's what we've done for 200 and some years. We've loved the strengths of this country and worked on the weaknesses.
Amen. Question 3. What is an issue that you are not working on now, but that you're really passionate about and you think is important?
Well, I don't know enough to say that I'm passionate about it, but I think an issue that doesn't get nearly enough attention is the treatment of incarcerated people. I think if the rates of recidivism, the rates which incarcerated people when they're freed commit another crime, make you think we must be able to do more with people in years in prison so that they wouldn't have to turn to crime when they get out. I doubt they want another trip to prison, right. But I don't know how. I don't think we do nearly as much as we could. I don't think we do much at all to try to give them a hand at creating a new life for themselves.
Well said. There are nonprofits that work with the folks that are called returning citizens, but yes, I'm sure that it's not nearly enough. Question number 4. What is your favorite movie about journalism?
Well, you named it. It's All the President's Men, made in 1974 by a director named Alan Pakula, now deceased. It's a remarkable job. I guess it was actually 75, released in 76. You named the cast, and Jason Robards and Ben Bradley was another.
Yes. Yes. Great. I thought you might say that, but I had to ask anyway, because there are so many others. The last question number 5. Don Graham, former publisher of the Washington Post. What is your hidden secret superpower? What is a skill or talent you have, something you're really good at that most folks can't do?
None. I have no abilities other people don't. But I'm lucky. I've got, I've had a very lucky life, obviously. And I now have a wife and 4 children I dearly love and 4 grandchildren I dearly love. And in that, I think I think grandchildren are the one subject in the United States on which there are no political differences. I find that supporters of every political party feel the same about those.
There you go. That's fantastic. Well, Don Graham, what an honor it's been to kibitz with you today. Thank you so much for taking time. And I look forward to seeing you soon, talking to you soon, and continuing to work together on behalf of immigrant kids and professionals who deserve an opportunity here in Maryland.
Look forward to that too, Senator. And I thank you so much for your work on their behalf.
Thank you. Stay safe. See you soon.
Bye.